Hello, everyone. So I hope you're doing well. I sent out an email yesterday with a lot of information, so I'm not going to go over that in too much detail. Um, just a reminder, if you haven't met with your group yet or you haven't, been in touch with everyone, we're going to give it a couple of days for you to, everybody to get in contact with one another. So, don't stress out about it too much if you haven't been able to find your group or not everyone has contacted you. A lot of you are spread out now across the world. So, we're going to be, very, very understanding and accommodating about that. Okay, so just kind of moving on, we're going to talk about immigration and sort of ethnicity and how it relates to immigration. Be sure to read that portion of the book. And then I'm going to talk about affirmative action, and I'm going to upload the lecture on gender inequality probably on Thursday, gender inequality and sexuality. So I'll be talking about that on Thursday. My voice is not great today, so I'm going to try and not tell as many jokes and just focus on the material. Okay. And also I will be updating the COVID-19 sort of section that I have in the modules, and also uploading some videos regarding some of the recent chapters we've covered, including this one. So anyway, stay tuned for that. Okay, so immigration. So this is an important topic. This was a huge topic politically before COVID-19 really broke out, and now we're going to see even more dramatic changes with immigration. So immigration is people leaving one place. Immigration is people entering a country. So the thing we have to understand first of all is just understanding the way the human species has sort of moved around the world, which we have. So we're for the most part kind of a semi-nomadic species, in that we move, we have a history of moving around the world, excuse me, and as well as settling too. Now, in terms of the modern world, we've developed over the last 100 years, 100, 200 years, most of the world has now been sort of sectioned into nation states with borders. And so we have, complex systems of citizenship and emigration. And this is related to ethnicity and race in a lot of ways because, you have these different societies and, as we talked about, different civilizations that often span several different countries. And within a lot of these countries are kind of built around populations that are defined by their ethnicity or sometimes their race as well, but probably more so ethnicity in terms of as we think of it as a ethnicity as cultures, values, things like that. So throughout history, and especially in the modern world, countries and places have had to figure out how to manage immigration and emigration. So get your clickers out, just kidding. This would be the time I ask a question. It's something for you to consider maybe and pack back. What's the data say about immigrants and how they affect the economy? That's always kind of a big question. There are cultural questions as well, but there's always a big question about the role that immigrants play for the economy. Generally, economists will say that overall immigrants often tend to provide economic growth. There's a lot of data suggesting that immigrants will revitalize neighborhoods, poor parts of cities. How will they revitalize it? Well, they'll move into these areas, they sort of create social networks, and you start to see the immigrants start businesses. In fact, I think it's very interesting that we see entrepreneurs come from two to parts of our society disproportionately. And I think I've talked about this before, but from people from families of wealth, so people who already have a financial cushion, and immigrants. So, why are immigrants starting businesses? Survival. Oftentimes they have trouble or, some difficulties in entering the traditional labor market due to things like a lack of social networks and not knowing about different opportunities, sometimes discrimination, sometimes language issues, oftentimes it's social networks and stuff like that. So starting businesses, immigrants will often start businesses to sell to other people in the immigrant community, and then kind of expand outward from that. But not everybody is starting businesses. So what about the role that immigrants play? Again, for the most part, they tend to play a positive role. Now, there is data to suggest in some regions, in some industries, that low-paid immigrants will lower wages, and that tends to be in some manual labor jobs, such as the housing industry, so building homes and so on. That is not universal, though, so it's very important to understand that. It happens in some regional housing markets, and it really kind of depends on other aspects of the labor market in those areas. So there in some sectors, primarily the housing sector, we tend to see that sometimes immigrant workers can lower wages. Again, that tends to be something that we see regional differences in. Okay, so where are immigrants coming from? As you can see, during the 1800s, most were coming from Europe by far. That stayed the case until the mid-1900s, and then really since the 1960s and 1970s, when you get changes in immigration laws, you start to see more and more immigrants coming from Latin America, South America, and from Asia, and not so many from Europe. So you can see here on this chart, you see Latin America. Europe is the purple here. Big rises up until the 1920s. There was a labor law, an immigration law that was passed restricting immigrants, especially from certain parts of Europe. They were trying to target Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in particular, as well as Ireland, and pretty much restricting all immigration from Asia and Latin America. And then that changed, as I said, in the 1960s and 1970s. Immigration laws changed to kind of basing it upon economic opportunities, education, things like that, and that's where you get a rise in immigration from Asia and Latin America. Now, the United States, as we know it, was first of all part of was comprised of a lot of different tribal areas. Now, the important thing to understand about the Native Americans was, first of all, that they were not a uniform group in terms of the type of society. So you had everything from agrarian, settled, almost feudal systems, and in some tribal places, and then nomadic hunters, especially in the Great Plains area. I'm from the Midwest and Nebraska, and you see that a lot of the tribes there, followed. Those were the ones that followed the buffalo and so on. In fact, a lot of the kind of stereotypes and caricatures of Native Americans in the United States are really images of a few specific tribes in the Great Plains, that wore headdresses. Not all Native Americans wore headdresses or followed the buffalo and things like this. In California, for example, the Chumash, they were, were very oriented towards the sea, and they had a very well developed system of currency, and so on. So, big differences between all these different groups. You can see kind of where around here some of the different tribal areas, the Susquehanna. In fact, a lot of names, especially in the eastern part of the United States and the Midwest, a lot of the names, Omaha, Nebraska, kind of where I'm from, for example, the Missouri River. A lot of these come from Native American. I shouldn't say even, this was pre-America, native, indigenous names. Now, as you know, the conquest of the Americas pushed a lot of the tribes from the east into reservations, and in fact, a lot of the tribes from the south and part of the eastern parts of the United States were put into reservations in Oklahoma. So this was the famous Trail of Tears, where a lot of people were marched, and you had thousands upon thousands die on the way from starvation and disease. We saw a lot of germs spread from Europeans who had built up immunities to different diseases, and this is relevant to what's happening with COVID-19. So Europeans had domesticated animals for thousands of years and had developed immunities to a lot of germs and diseases that would jump the species. Now, at the Americas, there were not any animals that you could domesticate. And that's extremely crucial to understand the history of why the Europeans conquered the Americas as opposed to the other way around. It was primarily because of that. There's a great book called Guns, Germs, and Steel that goes over it in a lot of detail. Along with this book, which I just happen to have in front of me, which by the historian Alfred Crosby, you probably can't see it actually, is called Ecological Imperialism, the Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900. And kind of looks at the ways in which Europeans spread all these diseases. Now, as I said, this is relevant for understanding COVID-19 because, we think COVID-19 came out of a wildlife, an animal market in China. And there you have a high density of people. You also have, in some places, a high density, especially in, where you have the animal markets happening and the distribution and so on, you have a high density of animals. And so there's just greater likelihood that there's going to be diseases, new viruses and so on that jump from one species to people. So that had been happening in Europe for thousands of years, from pigs and cows to humans, but humans developed immunities. Now, Native Americans did not have those immunities, so that's one reason why you saw tens of millions of people die from diseases. So today we see a lot of the reservations. You can see these, where the reservations are. Notice you don't see nearly as many in the eastern part of the United States as you do out west. That's because for the most part they were pushed westward or eliminated. And by the time that the United States started granting Native people tribes, for the most part, the eastern part of the United States, all of the land had been, taken over and developed and so on. You see here this insert of Oklahoma. That's where so many of the eastern tribes were put. So you've got a lot of different reservations for a lot of different tribes there. Now, I grew up, as I said, in Nebraska, right by Omaha, Nebraska, where the Omaha Reservation is up in the up kind of farther north from the city of Omaha. I have family who come out of the Pine Ridge Reservation. And Pine Ridge tends to be one of the poorest counties in the United States, and kind of exemplifies a lot of the challenges that reservations face. So, it's very hard to maintain the traditional ways of life and at the same time be part of the modern United States. And so it's been a big challenge. And so, I'm not sure if there's any easy answers. I think the problem is that you're seeing a lot of, dire poverty there. And I think, especially COVID-19, I've been, kind of reading about how the Native American healthcare systems have not been getting much attention. I mean, our government hasn't done a good job with any of our healthcare systems in COVID-19, but they've kind of ignored this population entirely, which is, again, one of the many tragedies that's coming out of this. Okay, so looking at Europeans now, one thing that's important to understand about Europeans and immigration. So Europeans have been coming for a long time, but it's not like it's been just one group of Europeans and they all identify with one another and, they're all just like, come on, more Europeans, just let's all go to America and we want you all to come here. So the history of American immigration is basically, sorry, shouldn't be scratching my face. Okay. The history of European immigration is basically, groups coming to the United States and wanting to close the door behind them. So I think you see a lot of cartoons like this that come out of the 1800s and early 1900s. So this is a cartoon where, there's a lot of let me back up. So a lot of white Europeans were primarily coming out of England, as well as France and Germany. And then you start to get in the 1800s, you start to get people coming from places like Poland and Czechoslovakia, Russia, as well as Southern Europe, places like Greece and Italy, and places that probably don't sound, like they'd be too dangerous today, but, at that time they were viewed as, these horrible places with, people that were going to ruin this new country. So you see here, Polish vagabond, German socialist, Italian brigand, English convict. So, even people that were coming from England, obviously the bad people that were coming, Russian anarchist, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of negative sentiments towards the Irish, towards Southern and Eastern Europeans during this time. Now it's kind of interesting because, I taught in California for a number of years and then now here at Penn State. And, I always think it's interesting when I think about the names, when I look at the names of students in the class. When I was in California, a lot of the names were primarily Asian or Spanish, because of a lot of students of Latin American descent. And a lot of those students were coming primarily from Mexico or other parts of South America, Central and South America. Here at Penn State on the East Coast, when I look at the names, primarily, or I would say that the majority are names that are Scottish or Irish, Italian, Greek, and so on. And a lot of the Spanish names, students tend to be from Puerto Rico, or at least Puerto Rican background, I should say. So it's a very interesting divide. You've got on the one hand, here on the East Coast at Penn State, a lot of the students, a lot of you are, a lot of your ancestors, are one of these people in this picture that, kind of came over with this big group. And then sort of a lot of the students, majority of students at, in the University of California system, their ancestors are more recent immigrants or, were from parts of Latin America or parts of Asia. So anyway, just kind of an interesting sort of divide, or not divide, but any difference that I noticed. Now, when we talk about immigration, we also have to talk about the fact that there are various attitudes about immigration. So we call them nativism this, favoritism shown toward, in this case, we're talking about Americans, but, if you're in Japan and you're against, immigration into Japan, Japanese nativism, English nativism, and so on and so forth. So early on, there was, fears that, the Southern Europeans in particular were going to be Catholics, and that was viewed as being such a bad thing, in the late 1800s. And so, they wanted, people coming from Britain and so on and so forth. So we tend to see, this idea that, some immigrants were from the wrong places, and you have a lot of ethnocentrism, that Anglo-Saxons meaning people coming from France, England, Germany, other parts of Northern Europe, were supposedly superior to others. Now, as I said, this is the act that I was talking about that restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. You can look at the details there. 1924 National Origins Act. And so this really, kind of cut down on immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and Asia until things were changed in the 1960s and then again in the 1980s. And we'll see what happens, as we move forward, as, we're starting to see other restrictions on immigration before COVID-19, and now we're going to see even more restrictions. So it's going to be, we'll just see what happens. Okay, so one of the things that's kind of interesting, this is actually, this slide, the data on here is a little old. This slide comes from about 2 or 3 years ago. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that immigration, kind of became this huge issue politically in the United States over the last few years, when illegal immigration has actually been falling since 2007. So basically what happened was that, illegal immigration was rising, over the last few decades, and then kind of peaking in the 1990s, and then started to fall then. And then actually really began, really fell dramatically when the housing market crashed. So why did that happen? Well, you had a lot of immigrants that were, people migrating from Mexico illegally and working in construction, working in, building homes and so on. When the housing market crashed, those jobs are gone. And so that's one major reason you see this decline that happened over the last 12 years or so, 13 years or so now. Other reasons, and this points to the long term, I think, the total fertility rates. If you remember total fertility rates, you have to understand population growth, you have to understand total fertility rates. Total fertility rates, the average number of children born per woman during her reproductive years. That has fallen dramatically since the 1970s. It was about 5 children per woman back in the 1970s. That's fallen to, I forget what it is, you can look it up right now. I believe it's around 2.3 or something like this. It's actually pretty close to the United States, or maybe it's around 3, I can't remember. Anyway, it's actually pretty close to the United States. So that means you're probably going to see less, as a cohort, less people in the next generation, next couple of generations in Mexico. So that's less people that will be looking for work in the United States. Now you get restrictions on immigration by the Trump administration, and whether those remain in place or not, we'll see. But probably, I think, even more consequential will be restrictions or just a lack of people wanting to move and relocate because of COVID-19. And we're in the beginning stages of seeing what this means for things like immigration. But I do want to point out that, a lot of people aren't aware that illegal immigration really has been falling since 2007, despite it becoming a prominent political issue in the last few years. That doesn't mean immigration has ceased as an issue of importance or anything like that, but, just, again, need to pay attention to the trend lines, perhaps more than the headlines. Okay, so again, we live in a very diverse country, and over the next few decades, the United States will change so that by the mid-century to the end of the century, there's not going to be any group that's a majority. We're probably, who knows? I mean, but maybe in 100 years, we could see the largest category being people of mixed race ancestry. But again, who knows? That's a long ways ahead, and a lot could happen between now and then. Okay, so this is just some finding. Gotta find out a good place to put my cell phone. No, I'll just do it over here. Sorry. Kind of looking at a survey that was done looking at how Americans kind of viewed immigrants today. So when they heard the word immigrant, 12% said illegal, 5% said overpopulation, legality other than legal, 4%, jobs, deportation, and things like that, each had about 3%. 49% generally offered positive, offered general description, and 12% of those were positive, 11% negative, and 26% neutral. And we generally tended to find over the last several years that Americans, and a majority of Americans tend to see immigrants as being positive, and that's stayed true over the last several years. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, so first of all, the first thing to say here is what term do we use here? So Latinos, Latinas, Latinx. That's sort of the new way in which to refer to people who, for the most part, live south of the United States, going down to the tips of Chile and Argentina. Latinx is a new term that's being used to move away from the masculine and feminine. I'm not using it quite yet. I think I'm going to start using it now. I think it's starting to be used more often now. But I also know that there are people and scholars across Latin America and some in the United States who are kind of opposed to the term Latinx, and it's controversial right now because, on the one hand, people don't like the masculine and feminine aspect of Latino or Latina. But there are people who are opposed to the Latinx term because they see it as kind of, another aspect of sort of cultural imposition or imperialism from sort of the universities and from certain more well-privileged groups in the United States trying to impose this upon people living in Latin America. So it's a complex issue. It's not certainly decided. So right now I'm just going to say Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, all kind of interchangeably. If I use any of those, you know who I'm talking about. But I'll update my terminology as society demands. So we're talking about a very, very large, very diverse group of people, with very different cultures, different practices, and so on and so forth, with very different histories and a part of the world that has some of the most biodiversity on the planet, Brazil, the Amazon jungle, as well as some of the greatest inequalities, and a lot of things are changing across Latin America. Another thing to make sure we distinguish the Hispanic from Latino, Latinx, and so on. So Hispanic refers to people from Latin America who have Spanish origins. Latino or Latinx refers to basically anyone from Latin America. So Brazil, for example, you can't call people from Brazil Hispanic because they speak Portuguese. So, Portugal, back a few hundred years ago, was a major power in conquering parts of South America. So that's where that distinction comes in. So most of the Hispanic population is coming from Mexico. Not all of it, obviously. On the East Coast over here, as I said, and as probably a lot of you know, a lot of the Hispanic population is coming from Puerto Rico. Same with Florida, along with Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean. But a lot of the western part of the United States is coming from Mexico, and not just coming from Mexico. Remember, most of the western part of the United States was part of Mexico for a long time. So you've always had, these long-standing cultural ties. So, the Hispanic population is, a very ingrained part of the western part of the United States. Not so much here in central Pennsylvania. You look at the center county right there. Just a brief little story. So, big fan of Mexican food, and living in California for 10 years, ate a lot of very great authentic Mexican food. When my wife and I moved here to central Pennsylvania, we went to some festival, and I don't know why. We should have gotten some local thing, but we decided to get tacos or something, and it was so disappointing. They were just not muy auténtico, as they say. So anyway, but hopefully we'll get some good, hopefully we'll get some good taco trucks in the area at some point. Okay. Moving on. Okay, so Latinos are a huge part of the population, and will continue to be that way for quite some time. So 1 in every 6 individuals are of Latino background. 1 in every 4 children. So kind of project forward. So again, a huge part of the population. And we're starting to see more recognition of significant Hispanic Americans and Latino Americans. Cesar Chavez was a important figure who was part of really kind of started the United Farm Workers to work for immigrant laborers in California who are picking grapes and strawberries and other types of food. And there's still a lot of exploitation that goes on there. There's still slavery happening, sort of, illegally, obviously. But there's still, as I said, a lot of exploitation of migrant workers from Mexico in particular, but other parts of Central and Latin America. And Cesar Chavez, kind of raised a lot of awareness of the conditions that were happening there. And he's kind of a major figure out west. California has Cesar Chavez Day, and schools and stuff is canceled. We don't have that here in Pennsylvania. Now, looking at Asian Americans, so this is this is actually, I believe, the fastest growing ethnic group in the United States. So people coming from Asia, and now Asia, enormous continent, and enormous diversity of people. So we're talking about everything from the Middle East, going to Israel is technically considered Asia. On the far sort of, depending on how you look at it, on the far one end of Asia, going to Japan on the other, down to Southern Asia, Indonesia, and so on, and going up to Siberia and northern Russia. So that's a lot of people. In fact, that's the majority of human beings are located in that area. So we're seeing huge increases in people coming from Asia to the United States, and the economy in East Asia, is booming, and so the links between the United States and Asia explain why we see Asian Americans having the highest incomes, the most wealth of any other ethnic group. For the most part, as we saw, a lot of immigration from Asia was restricted up until the 1960s and the 1980s. And then it kind of really takes off there. And what else is going on in the world? Well, the economy in Asia is also taking off. And so you have a lot of connections between people and families, business connections, and so on. So you have money being sent kind of back and forth, and people developing supply chain lines and linkages and so on. So that plus certain aspects of East Asian culture, is why we see a lot of success amongst Asian Americans. Well, let me go back here again before I just kind of go briefly over some history, because I do want to kind of emphasize this. So there's a lot of just fascinating social psychology research that's been done comparing different aspects of sort of Western American, European social psychology with East Asian social psychology. And a lot of the studies have been done looking at China or Japan, South Korea. Why? Well, because you have similar economies, you have similar educational levels, things like that. Levels of industrialization are now pretty similar in East Asia and in Europe and the United States. And there's just really fascinating studies, because one of the things that we see, and we see this really kind of playing out in terms of how these countries have responded to COVID-19. So lots of different studies, experimental research, and surveys, and all sorts of MRIs looking at stuff going on in the brain, shows that the ways in which a lot of East Asians in East Asia process information in terms of the whole. People in East Asia are more likely to take context into account, are more likely to pay attention to how things are connected. People in the West are more likely to pay attention to have a more individual focus and pay attention to things happening at the individual level. A fantastic example of this is this experiment that was done showing where participants were shown fish swimming through a fish tank, and there's some seaweed in the background, some rocks. There's one big fish and a few little smaller fish in the background. And they watch this 30-second thing, and they're asked to point out what they remember. So there's this fish that's in the sort of in the foreground, and this stuff in the background. So Americans remember the fish in the foreground very well. They're able to remember the detail and stuff, but not so much the stuff around it. A lot of people in East Asia, and I think this was Japan, I believe. People from Japan that were tested, and they were able to remember the sort of broader picture. They might remember the rock and the seaweed, the number of fish, that there was a big fish in the foreground, but not as much detail for the big fish in the middle. So what that showed is, kind of Americans thinking, the individual, but not so good with context, and people in East Asia being good with context, but perhaps not so much the individual. And then it's not some sort of biological thing, because there's studies done on Asian Americans, for example, showing that, as people become acclimated to Western culture, they start to, respond in these experiments more like Western Americans, people who have been in America for for a long time. So really really fascinating research there. And then people who have been adopted and so on and so forth. So it's all social, it's all different ways of socialization. And how this plays into COVID-19 is the ways in which that, China, South Korea, Singapore, the societies basically, everybody kind of agreed on what to do. They all kind of followed orders. There was just a lot more social solidarity, whereas in the West, in Europe and the United States, you've seen less of that. You've seen a lot of people just kind of do whatever they want, and that's led to the spread of the disease. Now, there's not, the East Asian way or the American way or whatever is not necessarily better at one or the other. Well, maybe in response to a pandemic, the East Asian way is better. But, the individualism and things, that's what the West has brought, and that's been sort of a great thing, too. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting how these systems sort of play out. You see the sort of pros and cons of these different systems based upon the situation. Okay. Looking at just kind of briefly the sort of history. So a lot of people from Asia started coming, at least in terms of modern immigration. In the 1800s, a lot of people from China come to the United States to first take part in the gold rush. They were discriminated against in the gold mining industry, so a lot of them then turned to the railroads, and a lot of people from China actually built the railroads out west. And then there was a lot of discrimination again, so they kind of turned sort of inward, and you started seeing the development of Chinatown in San Francisco, and then immigration was cut for a long time. You started seeing the people coming from Japan at about the same time. And more people started coming when Hawaii was taken over by the United States. And again, that was sort of cut off during that 1924 immigration restriction. And during the Second World War, of course, you have the internment of Japanese people in camps in the United States. One of the blemishes on more recent American history. Now keep in mind that we were also at war with Germany, but German Americans were not put in any camps, and it was not just Japanese. There were people from South Korea and people from, or I should just say Korea at that time, and people from China who were also put in these camps. People who looked like they were Japanese, basically. And that was, as I said, kind of a traumatizing thing for a lot of people that were put in it. There's a good graphic comic novel by George Takei, who was famously on Star Trek, about his experience as a child when he was put in the internment camps. Okay, maybe some things to think about: how to remedy unequal treatment, how to manage immigration and citizenship, because these are things that were already pretty complex, and now with COVID-19, it's really uncertain where, what happens to immigration as we move forward. So, definitely some things to think about. Okay, so I will be ending this video here now, and I'll be uploading this as well as the video, just a very short video on affirmative action. Have a good day.